says, in verse 14, it says, blessed are they, these are kind of like the final words of God to mankind. He says, blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life and may enter in through the gates into the city. For without are, and he lists here some pretty wicked people. He said, for without are dogs and sorcerers and whoremongers and murderers and idolaters. And listen to this. It says, and whosoever loveth and maketh a lie. It's an interesting way of describing a wicked person who loveth and maketh a lie. He didn't just say liars. You know? He does say that in other places in the scriptures, right? But here, the idea is who loveth and maketh a lie. I think one of the biggest discussions that we had last week, which made me think of something like this, was why would somebody do this? Like, why would Tischendorf come up with this? Doesn't that kind of astound you that there'd be a guy who would go out and set out to deceive? And why would he do that? Well, money, popularity, fame, but ultimately, who is the father of lies? Satan is. Satan is the father of lies. And I think that when you understand who the true enemy is, you'll begin to understand why these people lie and why they deceive. Okay? So it just says, loveth and maketh a lie. And then at the very end, it just says in verse number 19, if any man shall take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book of life. It kind of like ties all right in here. So you have here an interesting command from the scriptures. Now we're in our series on from the mouth of God of the King James Version, how we got our Bible. And today we're going to focus in on the critical text history. The first person that we looked at was a man by the name of, I said it earlier. Dieseldorf. Tischendorf, okay? Or Tischendorf, okay? Oh, now I'm going to have that locked in my mind, okay? But Ludwig Friedrich, okay, Friedrich Constantine Tischendorf, who lived between the years of 1815 and 1874, who saw that he did have a checkered background, to say the least, a colorful background. He was not a man of high integrity. He was a German scholar. After he died, we definitely see that his library contained stolen documents, and we also see that his account of discovering the Codex, which is the Codex Sinaiticus, which is one of the two main manuscripts that the critical text people base their document off of. His entire account is completely denied by the monastery from whence he said he got it from. He quote-unquote borrowed the Codex Vaticanus or Sinaiticus and never returned it. He found it in a garbage can. Why? He said that they were using it for kindling. Animal skins, leather doesn't burn. There are several chinks in the armor, several holes in the bucket, and it doesn't carry water. Okay, and so basically now what we're going to do is we're going to move from Tischendorf's claim to somebody by the name of Constantine Simonides. Simon, I-D-E-S. Simonides is how I've been saying it. Simonides. Okay, we're going to move to a man who was 5 years younger. He was born in 1820 and he died in 1867. So he only lived to be 47 years old. Simonides. Okay? And we're going to look and see, well, why in the world are we going to talk about a man? How many of you have ever heard of his name? Simonides. If I'm saying that. Simonides. I don't know. Simonides. We'll say it that way, okay? All right. He was born on the Greek island of Symi, S-Y-M-I, in the Aegean Sea near the coast of Greece. And his uncle, Benedict, was an official at the scriptorium at one of the monasteries at Mount Athos. Now, what was a scriptorium? Does anybody know? In the Byzantium Empire.
Yes, it was the library.
essentially it was a library, and at libraries, what did they do in these scriptoriums?
Told everybody to
That's where the modern day library, no talking comes from.
They
Okay.
saved documents.
What's that?
They saved documents.
They saved documents, they kept manuscripts, but particularly scribes in these scriptoriums would copy scriptures or copy documents, okay, in the scriptoriums. Now, in these scriptoriums, particularly the scriptoriums were dedicated for the place of scripture, so he definitely has the leaning on his side when he says scriptures in the scriptoriums, okay? And so his uncle, Benedict, was a high official at this monastery in Mount Athos, which was near the city of Thessalonica, where the book of Thessalonians comes from, okay? And this particular area, Mount Athos, had 20 different Greek monasteries. And these Greek monasteries in today's culture, I mean, it's no different if you have different universities, right? You have different mascots, you have different schools that hate each other, okay? Jeremiah's got his Ohio State tie on, and Tom's got his Penn State tie on today, so you guys are both sitting there on each side of the aisle, and you guys are representing different schools, and he's got his blue and white shirt, he's got his red shirt. I'm telling you, this is really getting, Ray, I'm going to need you to be a referee over here, okay? But essentially, there were cultures and subcultures, and there was rivalries and non-rivalries, and so he was at one particular monastery, Benedict, and Simonides, his nephew, is the guy who we're talking about here. Okay, so we're in Asia Minor area. Simonides was a paleographer. Okay, now I had to look this up because I didn't know what it was. Paleography is the study of ancient and historical handwriting and the process of handwriting. Basically, it's somebody who analyzed handwriting and studied it. Very interesting. It's still alive today. So, and today it's used in archaeology. It's also used in, it's used a lot in, like when you get documents, even in the English, and you can't read it. You ever notice that sometimes? Like even the Declaration of Independence, you ever notice like the handwriting was just so unbelievable, like it runs together? They study it, and they decipher handwriting, and they study handwriting. In fact, today, they will actually go to paleographers and they will ask about, is this a letter from the hand of somebody? And they use these paleographers in court. They study the handwriting. Was it forged? Was it this? Was it that? In fact, in high dollar crimes today, they still forge documents, or they forge pieces of art, or they forge, and they go to handwriting specialists. And that's what a paleographer is. And that's what Simonides was. His uncle was an official at the monastery in at the scriptorium in Mount Athos. Okay, keep this guy straight. He was his uncle Benedict wrote of Simonides, quote, thoroughly acquired the art of paleography and became so great a proficient therein that few surpass him either in the practice of it or in the diagnosis of manuscripts. So he was highly regarded, at least by his uncle, who was a well-known official, in a scriptorium, which was a place of education, okay? He was also highly regarded, not just by his uncle, but across Europe for his skills and knowledge of ancient literature. We're not talking about someone who was young and dumb. We're talking about somebody who was highly educated, okay, and particularly in paleography. He owned a collection of more than 5,000 ancient manuscripts. This guy was a collector, and he was all into his occupation of studying ancient documents and studying the authenticity of these documents and researching. Even back in the 1800s, okay, this was a highly sought after career. Even Tischendorf in 1856, even Tischendorf spoke highly of Simonides. This is what he had to say about Simonides. Simonides received an excellent education, and when a young man spent a considerable amount of time in the Greek monastery at Mount Athos, occupying himself almost exclusively in the study of ancient manuscripts, by means of which especially he greatly enriched his knowledge of the Greek and Egyptian antiquities. At the same time, he employed himself very much in the drawing and lithography, in which he became very skillful, and this skill was turned into account afterwards when copying the ancient manuscripts. Moreover, by vigorous studying and voyages in Asia and Africa, Simonides arrived at the climax of superiority in philology, particularly in the knowledge of the wonderful art of ancient manuscripts. So here's Tischendorf in 1856, highly touting Simonides. Simonides was not some unknown guy in some closet who comes walking onto the stage here. He was, in that day, in this arena, one of the leading and top scholars of his day, and particularly in relation to the scriptures. He was a paleontologist, studied ancient manuscripts. This is somebody who was well acquainted with the arena of ancient documents. Okay, so what happens? How are we introduced to Simonides? Tischendorf goes and he discovers the ancient manuscript, quote unquote ancient manuscript, at Sinai, the monastery at Mount Sinai. He brings that, makes up a huge long story. Over the next decade, basically, he eventually steals it all, and it ends up in Russia. Stays in Russia until 1933, so at this time it's in Russia, okay? This Sinaiticus, okay? And he had made some, facilities or copies of the document to have and whatnot. So he was presenting that. So even though there was the autograph was in Russia, he had himself a copy that he had done in a couple of months. Okay, that we talked about last week. So what happens is Simonides goes on an excursion. He was a well-traveled man, traveled extensively, obviously a man like him, well-traveled. He goes to Liverpool, England in 1860. In 1860, he sees a copy of Tischendorf's facsimile of the Codex Sinaiticus, which means he sees a copy of it. And he recognizes this document, and he immediately told the person he was with that that was his work, recognizing it immediately. And he then tells J.E. Hodgkins in 1860, immediately upon seeing it, recognizing that this facsimile was a copy of his own work. He wrote to Sir Thomas Phillips on August 2nd in 1861, a year later, and eventually the Literary Gazette printed an article on July 27th in 1861, saying, "We understand that in literary circles a rumor prevails that the manuscript now publishing by the Russian government under the direction of Mr. Tischendorf, purporting to be a manuscript Bible, of the Bible of the 4th century, is not an ancient manuscript, but is entirely a modern production written by a gentleman now alive, who will shortly take measures to establish his claim to authorship. This manuscript is known as Codex Sinaiticus and has attracted a large amount of attention throughout Europe. Should the rumor prove to be correct, as we believe it will, the disclosures that will follow must be of great interest to archaeology." So immediately upon seeing this facsimile of Codex Sinaiticus, there's a hand raised saying, that's not a Bible manuscript of the 4th century. That's actually a copy of my work, and I can prove it. And he tells one person, he tells another person, he tells another person, and he eventually writes a letter to the editor of the Literary Gazette, and he gets it published. And they haven't enough evidence to say that they believe it will shortly be, discovered that this is not a ancient document. Published this article, and immediately upon publishing this article, Simonides hears of two renowned scholars proclaim the Codex to be authentic and of great age. So immediately upon him coming out saying, that's not an ancient document, two well-known scholars come out and say, it's authentic and it's of great age. Immediately. And who are these people? Well, you have one by the name of Samuel Tregelles, who was a surrogate of Mr. Tischendorf, and you have a guy by the name of F.J.A. Hort of Westcott and Hort fame. And they both come out against Simonides immediately and defame him. Dr. Tregelles wrote a letter to the editor of the British newspaper, quote, The Guardian, on August 13, 1862, and he said, quote, the story of Simonides is as false and absurd as possible. Immediately. All Simonides was saying was, well, that's the work of my own hand. That's not a 4th century document. And I can prove it. And they come out and they say, that's absurd and it's as false as possible. And in fact, they verify that this document is of ancient antiquity and of whatever.
Authenticity.
Authenticity. And authentic. Thank you. Okay? Simonides reads this in the Guardian newspaper in September of 1862, and he says, quote, when about 2 years ago I first saw the facilities of Tischendorf, which were put into my hand in Liverpool by Mr. Newton, a friend of Dr. Tischendorf's, I had at once recognized my own work, as I told him immediately. And his claims largely go unheeded. They just kind of ignored Simonides, like, oh yeah, shut up, kid. And this guy is a 5,000 ancient document collector, famed in his paleontology work, saying, actually that's not a document, that's actually a document that I wrote. And I want you to, it's a little bit lengthy, and I want you to stay with me on this, but he writes a full letter. And he says this, I'm going to read it to you. He writes this to the Guardian after these guys dismiss him completely and they call him absurd, okay? He writes this. This was September the 3rd, 1862. Sir, as you have in your possession of August 13th, a published letter from a correspondent signing himself F.J.A. Hort, in which reference is made to me, I must ask you for permission to make a statement in reply. Your correspondent favors you with some extracts from a letter written by Dr. Tregelles, in which the following sentence occurs. I believe that I need hardly say that the story of Simonides, that he wrote the manuscript, is as false and absurd as possible. So he's going to respond to this claim that he's absurd. The manuscript referred to is that called the Codex Sinaiticus, now being published under the editorship of Professor Tischendorf at the expense of the Russian government. As what Dr. Tregelles calls my, quote, story, has never been published, and as that gentleman can only have heard of it through an indirect medium, it may interest both Dr. Tregelles and your readers to have the story direct from myself. I will tell it as briefly as possible. So he goes on to say, Dr. Tregelles says that my story is absurd. No one's ever heard my story. I just said that I wrote it, and I recognize it, and I can verify that. So he's saying, what story? I'm just claiming that that's actually not an ancient document. It's actually the work of my own hand. Here's the story. About the end of the year 1839, the Venerable Benedict, my uncle, spiritual head of the monastery of the Holy Martyr Panteleimon in Mount Athos, wished to present the Emperor Nicholas I of Russia some gift which had from time to time been offered to the monastery of the martyr. Not possessing anything which he deemed acceptable, he consulted with the herald Procopius and the Russian monk Paul, and they decided upon a copy of the Old and New Testaments, written according to the ancient form, in capital letters and on parchment. This, together with the remains of the 7 apostolic fathers, Barnabas, Hermas, Clement, Bishop of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias, and Dionysius the Areopagite, they proposed should be bound in gold and presented to the emperor by a common friend. Dionysius, the professional calligrapher of the monastery, was then begged to undertake the work, but he declined, saying that the task being exceedingly difficult, he would rather not so do. In consequence of this, I myself determined to begin the work, especially as my revered uncle seemed earnestly to wish it. Having then examined the principal copies of the Holy Scriptures preserved at Mount Athos, I began to practice the principles of calligraphy, and the learned Benedict, taking a copy of the Moscow edition of both Testaments, published and presented to the Greeks by the illustrious brothers Zosimus, collated it with the ancient ones, and by this means cleared it of many errors, after which he gave it into my hands to transcribe. Having then received both the Testaments freed from errors, the old spelling, however, remained unaltered, being short of parchment, I selected from the library of the monastery, with Benedict's permission, a very bulky volume, antiquely bound, and almost entirely blank, the parchment of which was remarkably clean and beautifully finished. First, I copied out the Old and New Testaments, then the Epistle of Barnabas, the first part of the pastoral writings of Hermas in capital letters, or uncial characters, in the style known in calligraphy as amphidextrous. The transcription of the remaining apostolic writings, however, I declined because the supply of parchment ran short, and the severe loss which I sustained in the death of Benedict induced me to hand the work over at once to the bookbinders of the monastery for the purpose of replacing the original covers, made of wood and covered with leather, which I had removed for convenience, and when he had done so, I took it into my possession. Some time after this, having removed to Constantinople, I showed the work to the patriarchs Anthimus and Constantatius, and communicated to them the reason of the transcription. Constantatius took it, and having thoroughly examined it, urged me to present it to the library of Sinai, which I accordingly promised to do. Constantatius had previously been bishop of Sinai, and since his resignation of that office, had again become perpetual bishop of that place. Shortly after this, I was placed under the protection of the illustrious Countess Etling and her brother, A.S. Storstus, by the cooperation of two patriarchs. But before departing for Edessa, I went over to the island of Antigonus to visit Constantatius and to perform my promise of giving up the manuscript to the library of Mount Sinai. The patriarch was, however, absent from home, and I consequently left a packet for him with a letter. On his return, he wrote me the following answer. My dearly beloved Son of the Holy Spirit, Simonides, grace be with you and peace from God. I received with unfeigned satisfaction your truly valuable transcript of the Holy Scriptures, namely the Old and New Testaments, together with the Epistle of St. Barnabas and the first part of the pastoral writings of Hermas, bound in one volume, which shall be placed in the library of Mount Sinai according to your wish. But I exhort you earnestly, if ever by God's will you should return to the sacred Mount Athos, to finish the work as you originally designed it, and he will reward you. Be with me on the 3rd of next month, that I may give you letters to the illustrious A.S. Storstus to inform him of your talents and abilities, and to give you a few hints which may prove useful to the success of your plans. I sincerely trust that you were born for the honor of your country. Amen. Constantatius, late of Constantinople. An earnest worshiper in Christ, island of Antigonus, August 13, 1841. After I received the above letter, I again went to visit the patriarch, who gave me the kindest and most paternal advice with letters to Storstus, after which I returned to Constantinople, and from thence went to Edessa in November 1841. Don't worry, I'll shorten all this down just a little bit, just read the full letter, okay? So for some of you who are like, what is this? Don't worry, I'll summarize it all. In 1846, I again returned to Constantinople, when I at once went over to the island of Antigonus to visit Constantatius, and to place in his possession a large packet of manuscripts. He received me with the greatest kindness, and we conversed on many different subjects, amongst others upon my transcript, when he informed me that he had sent some time previously to Mount Sinai. In 1852, I saw it there myself. So, okay, we'll get to this, but he goes to Mount Sinai in 1852 to look at his manuscript, and begged the librarian to inform me how the monastery had acquired it, but he did not appear to know anything of the matter, and I, for my part, said nothing. However, I examined the manuscript and found it much altered, having an older appearance than I thought it to have. The dedication to the Emperor Nicholas, placed at the beginning of the book, had been removed. I then began my philological researches, for there were valuable manuscripts in the library, which I wished to examine. Amongst them I found the pastoral writings of Hermas, the Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, and the disputed epistle of Aristias to phylacteries, all written on Egyptian papyri of the 1st century, with others not unworthy of note. All this I communicated to Constantius and afterwards to my spiritual father, Calastris, at Alexandria. You have thus a short and clear account of Codex Sinaiticus, which Professor Tischendorf, when at Sinai, contrived, I know not how, to carry away, and going to St. Petersburg, published his discovery there under the name Codex Sinaiticus. When about 2 years ago I saw the first facsimile of Tischendorf, which were put into my hand at Liverpool by Mr. Newton, a friend of Dr. Tregellis, I at once recognized my own work, as I immediately told him. The above is a true statement of the origin and history of the famous Codex Sinaiticus, which Professor Tischendorf has foisted on the learned world as a manuscript of the 4th century. I have now only 1 or 2 remarks to make. The name of the professional calligraphist to the monastery of St. Panteleimon was Dionysius. The name of the monk who was sent by the Patriarch Constantius to convey the volume from the island of Antigonus to Sinai was Germanus. The volume, whilst in my possession, was seen by many persons, and it was perused with attention by the Hadji John Hadrimus, son of Papa Patrimus, who was a minister of the Greek church in Trebizond. John Prodromus kept a coffee house in Galatas, Constantinople, and probably does so still. The note from the Patriarch Constantius acknowledging the receipt of the manuscripts, together with the 25,000 piastres sent to me by Constantius as a benediction, was brought to me by the deacon Hilarion. All the persons thus named are, I believe, still alive and could bear witness to the truth of my statement. Of the internal evidence of the manuscript I shall not now speak. Any person learned in paleography ought to be able to tell at once that it is a manuscript of the present age. But I may just note that my Uncle Benedict corrected the manuscript in many places, and as it was intended to be recopied, he marked many letters which he purposed to have illuminated. The corrections in the handwriting of my uncle I can, of course, point out, as also those of Dionysius the calligraphist. In various places, I marked in the margin the initials of the different manuscripts from which I had taken certain passages and readings. These initials appear to have greatly bewildered Professor Tischendorf, who has invented several highly ingenious methods of accounting for them. Lastly, I declare my ability to point to 2 distinct pages in the manuscript, though I have not seen it for years, in which is contained the most unquestionable proof of its being my writing. In making this statement, I know perfectly well the consequences I shall bring upon myself, but I have so long been accustomed to calumny that I have grown indifferent to it, and now I solemnly declare that my own motive for publishing this letter is to advance the cause of truth and protect sacred letters from imposition. In conclusion, you must permit me to express my sincere regret that whilst the many valuable remains of antiquity in my possession are frequently attributed to my own hands, the one poor work of my youth is set down by a gentleman who enjoys a great reputation for learning as the earliest copy of the sacred scriptures. He would go on and talk about a few more things here in a different letter at a different time relating to the manuscript, giving him a few further reasonings as to why he wrote the manuscript. And he was writing the manuscript for the Russian Czar in exchange for a printing press. He was saying thank you, but he was also hoping to get money from the monastery, money for the monastery to obtain a printing press. So it was kind of like hey, the Russian Czar is really rich. Why don't we give him a really nice gift that we can do, and as a thank you, but then also slip in a printing press to us. Okay, so that's what he was basically saying. So let's go through this little by little, and let's not bore you out. Okay, number 1. Here's what his letter states. Simonides was asked by his Uncle Benedict in 1839 to prepare a copy of the Bible as a gift, okay, along with several other apostolic writings. Hermas, Barnabas, and other letters, okay, as a gift for kindness to the Russian Tsar, but also in hopes that the Russian Emperor would provide funds for the monastery to obtain a printing press. So that was why he was commissioned. He's stating in this letter why he wrote this Codex Sinaiticus, as they're calling it now. Secondly, the staff calligrapher of the monastery, by the name of Dionysius, was leery of the project of such magnitude that he declined to take the lead in the project, and thus Simonides ended up doing it. And Dionysius assisted him in this project, as well as his uncle Benedict did. His uncle Benedict, he goes out of the States, located the Greek manuscripts. He collated and collected several Greek manuscripts, principally the Moscow edition, and because it's Russian, and prepared a text for Simonides to copy. They determined to do the copy in uncial or uppercase letters, which was the Greek style of writing in the early centuries of Christianity. So they were making a very antique looking document, but wrapped in gold, a collector's edition copy of the Bible. So he's saying exactly why he did what he did, using the ancient form, and he was a paleographer, okay, a paleographer, how to say it? Paleographer, there we go. And so he says a codex, which was basically blank, was found in the library of the monastery. So he took that, took out the pages that were written on, and the rest of it was largely empty. And so it was beautifully bound. The pages were a little bit older, and he chose to use that one for this particular project. And it says that he was assisted by the scribe Dionysius, his uncle as well, and the copying was completed in 1840 and done in haste, resulting in many mistakes. And he wrote that in his letter. His uncle, knowing that this was going to be recopied, made all kinds of markings all over where he needed to correct this document. And due to the amount of errors, the project was no longer fitting for the gift of the Caesar, and the project was disbanded. So he's saying what happened to this letter. Okay? Instead of disregarding it, a friend of his encouraged him to give it, because it still had value, give it to the monastery at Sinai, and the reason why it was because this friend of his used to be one of the officials at that Sinai monastery. So he gives, underneath the persuasion of this fellow, he gives the document to a friend of his who eventually would relay it down to Sinai. Once it reaches Sinai, several years later, he goes and he gets down there and he notices it, and it's been altered. His page, his dedication page to Nicholas of Russia, the Caesar, was gone. There were several other changes in there, and he was like, and he started inquiring about it, and the monks there were unsure of what was happening with this document. And the Simonides then ends this letter by directly accusing Tischendorf of chicanery and fraud in claiming the antiquity of what came to be known as Sinaiticus. So he ends by saying, here's the story. Tischendorf is lying. Okay? This is unbelievable. Okay? Because what do all of the modern Bibles say about the critical text in the margins and everything else?
They must be from the Sinaiticus, whatever it's called.
Well, they're all from. They all use the critical text, which is Codex B and Aleph, which is the Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. The oldest are the best. The older, the more reliable, right? So Tischendorf is claiming that he discovered a manuscript from the 4th century, and he is getting rich and famous off of this claim. Rich and famous off of this claim. Nobody knows how he got it.
Do we know whether all of his original errors were still in?
We'll get to that. There's some forensics there that we're going to talk about, not today, but we're going to get to that. His entire claim, Tischendorf's claim on how he obtained this document, is completely false. All the monks denied it. Even Westcott said, we don't know how he got this document. But everybody is saying, oh, it's the oldest document. And Tischendorf is getting filthy rich on this claim that it's 4th century. And you've got a guy over here who's raising his hand saying, no. And he gives And unbelievable, immediately he says so, and then 2 years later, it's still, he's being muffled by the press, and he's saying, hey, I'll give you my whole story. And by the way, that story was printed not just in one paper, it was published in The Guardian on September 3rd, it was also published in the Literary Churchman on December 16th, it was also published in the Journal of Sacred Scriptures in October of 1862, it was getting around. Tischendorf, or Simonides was putting his name on the line with a story that was unchanging. And 2 years prior, he kept the same story as what he wrote in the newspaper. Nothing changed. He gave details, and he says in there, he goes, I could take you to 2 specific spots where I put my initials on pages because Simonides was being attacked even a few years prior to this. Okay? Interesting enough, and I'll get to that in a second. Interesting enough, when for the next several years, the debate between Tischendorf and Simonides begins to mount. In fact, in 1982, not too long ago, 1 year before I was born, so 40 years ago, an entire book was written by J.K. Elliott entitled Codex Sinaiticus and the Simonides Affair. And it details the back and forth argument between Tischendorf and Simonides. And what's clear in this book is that the established press and the world of academia in England attacked Simonides. That sounds kind of familiar today, I mean, if you think about it. I mean, was it Trump that was colluding with Russia? Yeah. You follow what I'm saying? Was it? How many years did it take? Almost 7 years. 6. They said that he was colluding before. Anyway, I'm going to get off track, okay?
Russia's always in it.
And this was a voluminous book. Yeah, Russia's always in it. You're right about that. A voluminous book. However, I want you guys to do one thing. Pause to consider Simonides' story for just one moment. Okay? And what you're going to notice in here is something astounding. Many details. Details galore are in his published story. He mentions the monastery of the holy martyr Pantaleon of Mount Athos. He mentions the specific year when he wrote it, 1839, completing it in 1840. He mentions his uncle Benedict, who was the official, the calligrapher Dionysius the Areopagite, the brothers Zosimus, specific sources of manuscript that he used to copy it, the Moscow edition. Very specific documents. He mentions the exact style of calligraphy, amphidextrous. He mentions Constantius, and he was very notable in the Greek Orthodox circles whom he was communicating with all along. A.S. Stortzas, Paul, go down the list. He mentioned all kinds of names in there. He gave a clear timeline of events from his journey to the island of Antigonus all the way through to his trip to Odessa, to his trip to Constantinople in 1946. He notes a journey to Mount Sinai where he saw his work altered. He mentions other witnesses to his work, such as Haji John Protimus, who worked at a coffee shop in Galatas, Constantinople. He mentions the deacon, Hilarion. He mentions a fellow by the name of Kalanakas. He mentions specific pages in Sinaiticus which would bear distinct markings attesting to his writings of Sinaiticus. He mentions his distinct notes in the margins which confused Tischendorf, and he could say exactly what they were because he was noting which manuscripts he was reading off of as to how he came out there. He mentions details. Now consider Tischendorf's story. He saw these in a garbage can, and he took them, and all the monks are saying, no, you didn't. Okay? And at the very end of his letter, you have a question?
No, it's just so obvious that Tischendorf got a lot of money, and everybody started putting into the whole game, and if they got mud on their face, they look like trash, they'd probably be broke, so who cares about the details? Go away.
You said it.
You know.
And that's what it is today.
And not only were the details said once, they were probably said more than the same details the whole way through.
All the way throughout, they've never changed. They've never changed. Simonides has never changed the story. What does Simonides have to gain? What did Tischendorf have to lose?
Everything.
Everything. Okay? At the very end of his letter, He said, I believe all of these people are alive. You can verify the stories. How many of these people were witnessed by, how many of these witnesses were interrogated by the Guardian newspaper? 0. Not 1. Okay? None of the witnesses were ever sought out. Okay? However, a surrogate of Mr. Tischendorf, a man by the name of W.A. Wright, sent a letter to the British consul in Thessalonica, Greece, with a list of questions about Mount Athos and Simonides' account. And a British consul officer by the name of Richard Wilkinson replied to Mr. Wright and essentially said that Simonides' story was false. He was the fact checker. And published his findings on November 11th, 1863 to the Guardian, stating that Simonides was a liar. One guy hired by the crooks. Isn't this ridiculous? I think the Lord gave us a modern day example to help believers know the truth. Because the story is so absurd. What you're reading detail by detail, I think you say, surely they would have went and talked to these people. They would have went to this monastery. They would have talked to these. Sure, they didn't do anything. Tischendorf hires a guy to go and he asks the guy, is he true or false? Oh, he's false. Okay, he's false. He publishes it in the library, in the paper. However, immediately after, so November 11th, 1863 is when they published saying Simonides is a liar. J.E. Hodgkins gets onto the Literary Churchman on December 2nd, 1863, and he counters Mr. Wright on the Guardian, from the Guardian Research, saying he had interviewed the rivaling monasteries of Mount Athos. Mr. Wright didn't even interview Mount Athos. Went to the neighboring ones to gather information about the monastery at Mount Athos to see what was going on. And these were Ohio State fans talking about Penn State. And they're saying, no, he's a liar. Now, understand a couple of things here. I got to back up for 1 second. Simonides had a noble reputation. Okay, and we're going to get to 1 second. We're going to get there for a second because he was sued a year earlier by somebody. Interesting. Simonides not just sued, but taken to court, charged with fraud. Okay. Simonides, in distinction to Tischendorf, Simonides had a great reputation by men such as Joseph Meyer of the Meyer Museum in Liverpool, the curator of the museum, which was J.E. Hodgkins, Charles Stewart, and others. These are all men who are big time in the world of manuscripts, all of these antiquities. Okay, he himself owned 5,000 manuscripts alone. Okay, and a paleographer. Okay, Stewart, Charles Stewart, who I just mentioned, who held him in high esteem, said this. He wrote a biography of Simonides, defending him of a controversy that erupted at the University of Leipzig with Tischendorf and another scholar named Dindorf in 1857. So remember, in 1856, Tischendorf was praising Simonides. In 1857, Tischendorf charges Simonides with fraud, along with a guy by the name of Dindorf. Okay? Simonides was charged by Tischendorf. Interesting. Tischendorf is doing something. Could it be that there was reason why Tischendorf needed to accuse Simonides of things? Simonides was arrested. He was brought before a German court. The German court threw out all charges and exonerated Simonides. Sound familiar? The court say, there's no case here. Exonerated him, acquitted him. Charles Stewart wrote 2 years later, I may add that the high opinion I entertain of Dr. Simonides as a gentleman and a man of honor at the time I published his biography has not diminished during the 2 years that have elapsed. I know him to be utterly incapable of committing the disgraceful deeds imputed to him, and firmly believe that the truth and value of his statements and discoveries will be universally admitted and recognized. So here's a man putting his entire reputation on the line, saying, I know this man, and time will tell that he is a man of integrity. Simonides. However, if you Google Simonides today, Google it, you will see Simonides, the forger. That's what you're going to see. Just as much as you'll see in about 100 years when you Google Trump, you will see articles that Trump allegedly colluded with Russia. You will see that. That will not go away. They will hold on to that, because if you say a lie long enough, if you love a lie and you make a lie, you believe a lie, and you'll hold on to that lie until that lie becomes true in your mind. And that's exactly what happens here. What happened in 1855? Here's what happened. In 1859, Simonides appeared at the University of Leipzig in Germany, where he produced what appeared to be an ancient document entitled The History of the Kings of Egypt up to the reign of Ptolemy Lagus. It purportedly dated to the 12th century, and two professors, Dindorf, where did we just hear that name? He's the guy who was suing with Tischendorf, charging him with fraud. So Dindorf and Anger, another guy, he purchased this document in 1855 from Simonides for 2,000 something, a lot of money, okay? Not $2,000, but 2,000, whatever the currency was there. It was a lot of money. And all of a sudden later, they claimed it to be a forgery, and they reported it to the authorities. So this is what Tischendorf is going after. So they purchased this document. Two guys who were well-known people purchased this really expensive ancient manuscript, 10,000-page manuscript. Sinaiticus was about 1,000 pages. This was a 10,000-page history book. They purchased it. All of a sudden, a year later, Tischendorf and Dindorf are suing him for fraud. They come in and arrest Simonides. Simonides refunds he refunds his accusers all their money on the spot. This is Simonides. Can you imagine that? He goes to court. There's absolutely no charges against him. They're all dropped. He's acquitted. Tischendorf has got allies and surrogates who are after Simonides. And Tischendorf is in the midst of all this controversy. Everybody around Tischendorf is attacking Simonides. He has a reason to attack Simonides.
Simonides has the truth.
Simonides has the truth. Yes.
Why, in this world, did he sell it to him when he was sued by him before?
Say that again.
Why did he sell that to Tischendorf when he tried to sue him the year before?
So
Why would he sell it?
your timeline's mixed up. So I probably got you confused on that. It was
That would be easy to do.
in 1855 is when he sold it. Is 1856 is when he gets tried. I just mentioned the trial case before.
When? Okay, so when did they try to sue him the first time?
1856 is when.
So there was only one time of suing, not two.
I believe so. Only one time. It was Tischendorf, Dindorf, and Anger. That's correct. Dindorf and Anger bought the manuscript, but it was Dindorf and Tischendorf who charged Simonides. So Simonides is behind this whole thing saying, hey, look, let's call this a manuscript that's forged. And they charge him in 1856. Okay? But keep in mind that, I forget what year it was around the same time, right before all this happened, Tischendorf was praising Simonides. And all of a sudden, he's demonizing Simonides. Isn't that interesting? What was Trump before he ran for president? The Apprentice. He was praised everywhere, man. All these people were praising Trump everywhere. Run for president, and they accuse him. Okay? So he's acquitted. All of his accounts are acquitted. There is no forgery. There is no wrongdoing here. But Simonides the forger sticks. They tarnished his reputation. Now, he had upstanding reputation still in a community. In other words, we love Trump. But the media, the Guardian particularly, had it out for them. They wanted to disparage Simonides. In fact, Samuel Tregelles, we heard his name earlier, he was an associate of Tischendorf, closely connected, claimed other forgeries from Simonides. In fact, there was a fragment of the Gospel of Matthew and of 1 John 5:7, right there, man, on display in the Meyer Museum, and Simonides was hired as a paleographer to go there and try to give insights onto these documents. Simonides had no connection to these documents, didn't own these documents, didn't sell these documents, didn't do anything. All he did was come in, just like other paleographers would do, and try to date these documents. And he dated it to be in the 1st century. Samuel Tregelles comes in and says, Simon the forger forged those. One person says it's forgery, and all history says, oh, it's forged. This is absolutely astounding. Okay? Now, I find it interesting. Simonides, he wrote in January 21st, 1863, to The Guardian. And he says this, quote, "Truly, I wonder how people can credit such unreasonable falsehoods, things wholly impossible, and believe the reports of Tischendorf, that I prepared pamphlets and wrote 10,000 pages of an Egyptian lexicon, 7,000 pages of the Alexandrian Philological Catalog, 10,000 pages of Irenaeus, 8,800,000 pages of various other ancient writings on different subjects, that I corrected the corrupted texts of various classical writers, filled up many blanks of injured ancient manuscripts, and wrote and prepared the papyri. And all this in a very limited space of time, for which a life of 2,000 years would not suffice me." He was charged with forging enough documents. The one document itself was 10,000 pages that they said he forged. And he's saying, do you know how long it would take me to forge 10,000 pages? It took me over a year to do 1,000 pages, and I'm telling you, there were so many errors in this 1,000-page document, and I had 2 other people to assist me. There's no possible way that I would even have time to forge this kind of document, let alone all these other documents. And the irony of the whole thing was that the one document that he was saying he wrote, they were saying, no, that's actually not one you wrote. So they were saying all these other ones, you forged, you wrote. And he was saying, no, I didn't write any of those. I wrote this one. No, you didn't write that one. That was an ancient 4th century document. And the only reason why they're saying that is because they owned that document. They stole that document. And they got very, very rich off of it. Okay, I'm almost done. So, in January 28, 1863, Simonides wrote to The Guardian, and he requested an open and public debate with the manuscripts in hand. To end the debate, he says, I can tell you specific pages where I wrote, because in 1855, he had been accused as Simon the Forger, or 1856, Simon the Forger. Now we are in 1863, so he's already got the tagline, Simon the Forger. Simon, everywhere he walks around, here's Mr. Truth walking around called Mr. Lie. That's what Satan does. And because he did that, in all of his documents from that point forward, he began to hide his initials in documents that he would write so that he could verify he wrote it, and if he didn't write it. It was a little neat way of hiding his signature in the painting for his work. One thing which Simonides had openly claimed was that he had placed several acrostics and monograms on the pages of Sinaiticus. That would confirm his account. Confirm that from the beginning. That's what he kept saying. I can show you. Show me the document. I can show you this is my document. I can show you the exact pages. In 1920, so obviously it never happened in his life. He asked and he asked and he asked and he asked for them to get the document for open debate. Tischendorf ignored him, never did. He had reason to ignore him. Okay? In 1920, a man by the name of Falconer Madden wrote that Simonides asserted that not only had he written it, but that in view of the probable skepticism of scholars, he had placed certain private signs on particular leaves of the codex. When pressed to specify these marks, he gave a list of leaves on which were to be found his initials or other monograms. So he listed it out before he died on what pages they were to be found on. The test was a fair one, and the manuscript, which was at St. Petersburg, was carefully inspected. Every leaf designated by Simonides was found to be imperfect at the part where the mark was having to be found. The exact pages that Simonides said, go to this page and look at this spot. And they went there, and the very spot that it was supposed to be, it was imperfect. There was a rip, tear, a smudge in these exact spots. Okay. The dating method of Sinaiticus. Looking at paleography just for a second. Paleography. Simonides directly asked Henry Bradshaw, who was the curator of manuscripts at the Library of the University of Cambridge, how he came up with the ancient date for Sinaiticus, because there was one man who said that Sinaiticus was of the 4th century. And he himself was a paleographer. And he was saying, he wrote a letter to Henry Bradshaw. He said, excuse me, how did you come up with that date? Because I wrote it, and it's not. I mean, we wrote it to look like a representation of something, but any paleographer could determine that that's not an ancient document. And we'll get to the forensics in a couple weeks from now, okay? Bradshaw wrote a letter. He never answered them. Bradshaw instead writes a letter to a friend, and he says this: Dr. Simonides wrote to me to convince me and my friends that it was quite possible for him to have written the volume in question. He had invited some of us to Christ College to discuss matters fairly, but the great question was, how do you satisfy yourself of the genuineness of any manuscript? I first replied, so he's saying now what he replied, how he decided that this was an authentic and an antique document. I first replied that it was really difficult to define, that it seemed to be more of a kind of instinct than anything else. Dr. Simonides and his friend readily caught this as too much like a vague assertion, and they naturally ridiculed any such idea. But I further said that I had lived for 6 years past and the constant, almost in the daily habit of examining manuscripts. So how was this verified to be the ancient document of the 4th century? One man who claimed instincts. This is ridiculous. It's so, if it wasn't so damaging to the Word of God, it'd be funny. One man said, it's instinct. I've been looking at documents for 6 years. I can tell a document when I look at it, it's old enough. And scholars to this day say the most reliable documents, the ancient and most reliable, the ancient and best documents, the ancient and best documents, and they completely threw away the received texts that have been used for the last 2,000 years in church history, right? Henry Bradshaw, the curator at the University of Cambridge. So here's what they have. Here's what Sinaiticus has. In the mid-19th century, the only criteria, right now, the only criteria for dating Sinaiticus to the 4th century are: 1, it was produced on parchment and not paper. Number 2, it was written in uncial-style lettering, which was ancient. Number 3, the pages and binding were the old codex type of binding. And number 4, it looks old and tattered. That is why they came up with the idea that it is dated in the 4th century. And Simonides said, I can tell you exactly why it is what it is. And I can tell you where my initials are. And I can tell you every single person who can verify it. And I will openly debate you in public, bring the manuscripts here, and I'll show you with my own hand. And they disparaged him. They took him to court. They sued him. He was found guilty or he was found innocent on all accounts. But the brand that Simon the Forger stuck, and they ridiculed him into history. To this day, where if you were to type, in fact, there's a book called Ancient Forgeries. And what's interesting in it is that they actually have Simonides and Sinaiticus in the book. What's funny about that is this author has determined that Simonides was the writer of Sinaiticus. It wasn't a forgery, though, because Simonides was saying it's not a forgery. I didn't deceive anybody. I'm telling you, I wrote it for this person. And this author recognizes that Simonides wrote it, but because the Sinaiticus uses the Bible, everyone is saying, oh, it's a forgery. And it's not a forgery. It's just happened to be in the book of forgeries because Simonides, he's determined, has written this article, has written the manuscript. So now we're going to turn our attention to Kallinikos Hieromonk, or the Holy Monk. We're going to turn to him because he's the next key eyewitness in the story. But isn't that good? Interesting. All right. Tom's going to close us in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time we could share and, Lord, stimulate our minds in regards to the King James Bible. Thank you for Pastor's research and understanding and communicating it to us. I pray that you'll help us to think on these things this week. Thank you for the Lord's Day that you've given to us. Pray that you'll lead, guide, and direct everything we do, say, and think this week, and bring us back.